The 2025 session of the Indiana General Assembly officially begins next Wednesday. This is the budget session as lawmakers return to the State House with the charge to prepare and pass a new two-year state spending plan. What else lies ahead legislatively for the General Assembly between now and the end of April? We'll discuss that question with our guests, and we'll take your questions as well on this edition of Primetime. And good evening, I'm Bruce Haines. With us today are Mike Wolf. He is Chair and Professor of Political Science and Acting Director of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. Fred McKissack is here. He's Editorial Page Editor at the Journal Gazette. And Mitch Harper is with us, local attorney and a former state representative. And we invite you to join us here in studio. Just call the number you see on the screen with any questions or comments you'd like to share as we go along. And then meanwhile, though, let's say hi to Fred, Mike, and Mitch. It's a new year, and may it be a happy one. Gentlemen, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having us.
Happy New Year.
So one thing a little different than, say, 12 months prior is we haven't had a change in Indiana's chief executive for 8 years, 2017. Governor Eric Holcomb steps down. Governor-elect Mike Braun's preparing to step up. So let me start with the easy question of what does this transition do or mean for the dynamic between the branches, the executive branch, the legislative branch? There's been some continuity. Now we have the important personnel move. And does it matter at all, or what kind of matters in your mind? Fred, start with you.
Well, okay, let's take something like property tax reform, where I think Braun has his ideas. It appears that the supermajority, at least the leadership, has its ideas. Now, can they blend those ideas? I'm pretty sure they can. It's not that big of a step for Braun's policies into the ideas the supermajority would have. But change is always. Political change is always going to be a little bit different. This is, will Braun look at himself as being, the supremo of the party, even with different branches of government, or will he be more of a person committed to, working with the legislative branch and, finding these solutions that we need? I mean, we're talking about Medicaid funding. It's a $1 billion shortfall. That is going to be huge. And there's not the money, there aren't ARPA funds anymore, which, buoyed and helped a lot of projects, but certainly, given the funding issues that we're talking about, they're going to have to be cooperative. And we'll see how it happens.
Yeah. Mike, how about you, sir?
Yeah, I take it back even 20 years when Mitch Daniels became governor and promised no culture war issues. This is a different time, and Indiana's a different place. It was the most competitive state in the union at this legislative level. It's no longer that clearly with the supermajority. It's one of 38 trifecta states. And I really think the culture has changed substantially. And we'll see whether this, it's not even the governor, it's the governor and lieutenant governor, and whether that's split and what side of the party gets pulled and the active part of the party in this legislative session, because there's even a divide here, what we see at across all of those executive offices, including Attorney General and everything else. So I do think we're going to see a state legislative session we haven't seen in decades. So it's a different culture.
Yeah. Mitch, you were part of a state house that was always keeping an eye on the executive and the other eye in a variety of spots. How about this year? What's going on with your colleagues?
Governors enter their first term in different ways, and some don't have a big legislative package prepared. They're finding their way. I would say Bob Orr was one of those. Others, like Mitch Daniels, as I described his administration, he hit the gasoline. Driving the car, it snapped everyone's heads back, and he didn't let up the accelerator till his term was done. I think Mike Braun will probably come out of the gate pretty strongly, and I can't say exactly what the things will be that he proposes. Josh Kelly, who is his chief of staff, has worked with a lot of the legislators in terms of their campaigns and what he had prior done. And I think the interesting thing about Governor Braun is his reorganization of creating a really true cabinet. Indiana, like a lot of states, was a collection of bureaus and commissions and departments, and those names all meant something. And some of them, particularly the commissions, operated as completely unto themselves. He's kind of brought everything under, one can say, given his background, a much more business-like form. And I think it could perhaps be the biggest step on reorganization since Governor McNutt tried to lasso all of those boards and commissions back when he assumed office in the Depression.
Yeah.
I think Governor Braun probably will come out of the gate with some key proposals, but I don't know what they are. I don't think he's really given that signal.
Yeah, I was reading about this notion of 8 verticals that are being created within the administration where those cabinet members are overseeing those agencies, and the call, Governor-elect Braun has said that this layer of management would create government efficiencies and be entrepreneurial and accessible. Mike, you study this species. What do you think, Willie?
Well, organizations and reorganizations always really look good and make sense, as mentioned. Sometimes the rollout, though, you run into civil service and legislative. I think certainly the legislature will have something to say about how the policies get implemented at the front end if they see something that they want definitely done, and include that in the legislative session. So we'll see. I mean, it's truly important, I think, to always be looking at the structure of government. And Mitch Daniels tried to do this with these boards and reorganize them, ask everyone to leave and other things. Governor's always trying to do this, and I do think, though, that there's some sense in the structure of this to make this, and maybe that's due to his time in Washington, too, and seeing how organizations can be better set up at the executive level.
Mitch, do you see where those efficiencies can come? Does this reduce the number of emails along the way as a topic is discussed or a policy is implemented?
They might ease the number of emails and the number of contacts between agency heads and different persons on the governor's staff. I think depends on how some of these folks that have been named for the cabinet are going to gain control over these agencies. Some of those agencies will have people in them, and Mike alluded to the bureaucracies, who will be very jealous of giving up what they've seen as their prerogatives and their direct connection to the governor's office. So that's all going to be worked out, and some of that involves human nature.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I guess there's not only the dynamic between executive and legislative, but also within executive and within legislative, too. We also have 14 new lawmakers coming into the State House for the first time around.
Yeah, we'll see how, again, how they are absorbed into, the current system. But, it's funny, getting back to, streamlining, the bureaucracy. I like the idea of entrepreneurship as long as there's transparency. And as long as, as a journalist, as citizens, as a professor, we see how this is going. There are times in the past 8 years that I think, the Holcomb administration could have been a little bit more public. I always worry about what's going on at IDIC. And, I don't think they're terrible people. I just think that, sometimes saying, well, we don't want to scare off developers, so we're going to keep everything secret. This is government, and it's the government of the people, and we ought to, continue to demand that it be the government of the people. The other thing is yeah, I agree about these, the structure of government as being sometimes, unfortunately, little fiefdoms. But, if you look at some businesses that are very successful, they see themselves as ecosystems. Why can't education and health talk with each other? Why can't these groups think? That would be the entrepreneurial point for me, is, groups that tend to, that should work together. see themselves as a part of a bigger ecosystem than here's my little fiefdom, I don't care what happens in education. Or here's my little fiefdom, I don't care what happens in workforce development.
And one thing
Please.
just to add is that I think Mitch Daniels, if anyone, was somebody that really transformed the state. And one of the big changes he made, the FSSA fell on its face. I mean, so that some of these things might work great, others might really trip up. And so there's, lauded him for doing and making these changes and seeing this. Hopefully the transition will work.
Yeah. I know we talk about this session as the budget building session, but Mitch, this budget's been in the act of being built like ever since Organization Day, and perhaps in the hallways even before that time in November.
Well, and the budget is not so much being built, but some of the entitlements and so on are dictating what's being spent. And as Fred said, there isn't any extra ARPA money rolling around. There isn't a great revenue situation. They're going to be working under constraints. And when you're working under constraints, there are tough choices to be made. I think you've got some strong hands in the legislature in regards to that. I think Senator Mishler here in our region is key among that.
Yeah. I know there's the concern about Medicaid. We've come down from $1 billion. There have been some cuts, but yet concerns about underestimating enrollments and use of services and the pace of expenses going percentage-wise faster than the rise of revenue. And yet Governor-elect Braun is suggesting that he would rather not cut Medicaid access, but rather focus on lower-hanging fruit like reducing Medicaid fraud. Will that work?
Sure. It sounds good, but again, I love when we say things like Medicaid fraud. Okay, how much? I mean, has there been any research done? Does he know something we don't know? That might help. The other problem is that what if there are federal issues that come up also with Medicaid funding? If I remember, what was it? I think Indiana has a trigger law that would automatically cut coverage for about 30% of the state's Medicaid population should the Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion be slashed. I mean, yeah, great. I would love to get rid of the fraud part, but is that enough in itself to level things out and to treat people?
Not. And we had a session at Organization Day with the Mike Down Center, and the healthcare industry is talking about the fact that Indiana ranks 41st in the country in health. Our costs are going up simply because the health of the population is really bad. And I think certainly Governor Holcomb tried to address that. And that's a driver of the cost of Medicaid, not just who's eligible, but also the underlying cost of it. And actually the cost of health care in Indiana is ranked somewhere between 9th and 19th per capita, which is way too high. I mean, you can't have 9 through 19 and 41st in health outcomes and not have this gap that's going to be yawning and driving Medicaid and every other cost.
Right.
Mitch?
Well, I mean, you've got legislators, some here in Northeast Indiana, who've been pretty strident about healthcare costs and about looking at some of the larger nonprofits that are in that space. Professor Hicks down at Ball State has been constantly critical in terms of healthcare costs. I think that's going to continue. You have some very big players in that space. It'll be interesting as to how that, they didn't really move the ball very much in the last couple sessions. Will there be more radical change? I don't know. I think one of the other fiscal things is a little bit of what Governor-elect Braun has talked about is the property tax of really leaning hard on keeping Indiana's tax increases low, but perhaps allowing local units or telling local units, if you want extra revenue, it's not going to come from the state. You have some options of raising tax revenue. Well, that's not going to sit well with the public at all, because that's reminiscent of what happened under Governor Bai, where you had gone through the Bowen and Orr administrations of controlling property taxes, and that meant a little less revenue. Cities and towns had tough decisions to make. They didn't have options to raise revenue. Governor Bayh came in and said, his image was, we are really going to be frugal when it comes to Indiana state government. We're going to hold statewide tax increases to a low level. But they had all sorts of allowances for local governments to raise taxes. And pretty soon people were yelling about the increase in property taxes. Most of that hit Governor O'Bannon's administration when it got started under Evan Bayh. So they go through these cycles of controlling local government spending, and then governors look great in holding state spending, but allowing locals to raise income taxes and to have property tax increases and wheel tax increases. That we may be on that cycle again.
I'm waiting to ask you, so let me just do it now so we can be sure it gets in there. This is the time when the State and Local Tax Review Task Force brings forth its final report. And some of that, according to Senator Holdman's office, the final report includes multiple reform recommendations for property taxes and local income taxes. Is there sufficient time on the clock to try to see if any of that can be synthesized with expectations from the governor's office to be put next to a calculator and then determine what the best way forward might be?
Yes, and again, I think this is, what is Braun's thinking on this? I think he's a bit more aggressive about property taxes, and I think Goldman and that task force are not quite as aggressive on what should happen. I think one of the things the House had talked about was a sales tax on tourists bill. That probably won't go anywhere, but I mean that's where we're going with these things. Something has to be done. I think there might be. I think 2026 is the year that they're really worried about because revenues will be really down, and so 2025 might be a little bit easier for them to process the ideas, but 2026 is going to be really rough.
Yeah. I was looking at the idea that behind education, Medicaid is the second largest component within the budget, but then fighting for third or just additional shelf space mentally would be things like boosting transportation infrastructure investment, AKA road funding, which is something that has been maybe on the stove, slowly beginning to hit boil, but hadn't heard much about the push for that necessarily until right now. As a former lawmaker, how do you try to indeed make room on the spreadsheet? Or are there some that just stay in the parking lot, fiscally speaking?
We've kind of gone through, and we've all experienced it here in Allen County. There's been a lot of money sloshing around for local road and street funding. Allen County has had many projects. Fort Wayne has really advanced a lot. Certainly Governor Holcomb made that a priority. Now it's kind of coming to a halt, and how do you extend that funding in the future as you have different forms of transportation where the gas tax is not the be all and end all. They've got some issues to wrestle with. All of that comes down, I think, to strong leadership. I mean, and in a shorthand way, that comes down to a strong stance from Speaker Houston and how much he can lean on his caucus in order to move whatever they decide to do forward. It really requires strong leadership to lean on their members when it's going to come to some final leap. I don't know if they're all ready to do that.
Let's step away from the budget just briefly in the 7 minutes that remain. And so all of this is unfair. It needs a little more expansion time. But legislatively, Mike, let me start with you. Things that you've heard, themes from last session that may carry over into this one, new ones that might be introduced. What are you hearing as far as other issue topics that may become proposed bills in the next half a dozen weeks?
Well, that's what we're going to see. It's going to be very interesting because the property tax, clearly, there's already bills flying around. I mean, we've talked about the study committees and everything else, but people are already individually setting the agenda and trying to get out front on a lot of that. I also expect to see a lot, as we've heard in the race for governor and particularly in the primary, about more school funding changes, and that'll be a big thing. But I also, a more broad look and looking at things nationally, we should be looking at what Florida and Texas do, because as a trifecta state here where Republicans control everything with a supermajority and easily able to overcome a veto, by the way, a lot of the innovative things that Florida and Texas have done, I think, will catch on here, whether those are some of the culture war things that might slip in, even though there's a debate in a budgetary session whether those things will come in. I do think we'll find, particularly with newer lawmakers who have gotten elected with some of the more ideological energy, some of that action as well. So how clean can we keep things like Medicaid and property tax reform away from some of the other things entering in a budget year will be interesting to me, whether the culture war stuff really comes in.
On the legislative to-do list, what do you see?
Well, I think one thing that we have to, do talk about is the fact that, Indiana retains its AAA, credit rating. We do have reserves. It's not, the end of the world. I think one of the things you brought up was that, the second biggest thing, item is education. And a lot of that money is universal school choice. My predecessor, Karen Francisco, called this from the very beginning, that this was not simply about helping low-income children, get a leg up. That eventually, what we see now, which is, I think this year they want to raise it to $220,000 as, the high-end limit to getting a voucher for a family of four. Again, that's a lot of money that can be spent in other places. Universal school choice. Is an issue that I don't think people really take as seriously as they should in terms of like how we're spending the money and could that money have been used in other places in education, particularly since I think new scores show that public schools in the state by and large are doing extremely well. Does that mean that every school district is? No. Does every school? No. But overall, public schools do a very good job of teaching our kids.
Yeah. Mitch, legislatively, what things do you expect to see stories written about and conversations pertain to as we move forward?
Well, there'll always be some issues no one is foreseeing that'll capture the public's imagination or capture, Indiana Capitol Chronicle's imagination. Certainly one of them is Bob Morris's introduction of a bill to ban the death penalty. I know that it comes from a deep reservoir of belief in him, and there will be other supporters of that. That's going to be an interesting debate, even if the bill doesn't move along. There is a national group called Conservatives Against the Death Penalty that's been operating for 20-some years. It was founded by Richard Viguerie, and their idea was that if there's going to be a change in death penalty laws, it will come from conservatives, not from liberals. They've had quite a few successes and surprising successes around the country, and I know they're linked up with Representative Morris at this time. That's going to be an interesting debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when he announced that he was doing this, I was really shocked, and then I thought about it, that this reminds me of Father Ted Hesburgh, Notre Dame. A great human rights advocate, but staunchly anti-abortion and anti-death penalty, and was part of a Catholic tradition that I think some people can understand. Bob Morris and I are probably never going to be on the same sides on a lot of things, but we are on the same side on this. And I was very proud to have somebody from this area, push that legislation.
You each get 30 seconds on this, if that, but do you see any surprises? The surprise topic out of left field that suddenly seizes the imagination, and if not, that's okay. But Mike, it's the lightning round. We'll start with you.
Like I said, I think the culture war issues and higher ed for me, keep my eyes out on that to see changes in curriculum and what's allowed in that, because particularly with Indiana, Purdue, the strong university systems, they've been kept alone for a lot of years. But last year, I think with the tenure bill in particular, we might see opening up of some things, some other aspects of curriculum about women's studies and other curricular things that might be discussed.
Mitch, how about you, sir?
I think, given this New Year's events of this week, there will be a lot of public concern and attention. There'll be a lot of discussion on how prepared Indiana is to meet both public safety emergencies that are actions by individuals or by groups, and how prepared are we in terms of natural disaster. I think there's going to be attention on this, and some of that always is dependent on how the tornado season goes and how flooding may go, but this week I think has focused people's attention.
And Fred, you get 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
If that.
No, I agree with both of them. What I'm dreading is the cultural war nonsense that will come up, and then again make Indiana look like we're a bunch of knuckleheads, and we're not as a state. And what I would love to see is us figure out Medicaid, because that is the most important issue right now in the state.
Well, the perspectives are tremendous, as collectively it's a GPS for us to find our way with you through the upcoming General Assembly session. Stay with us as Primetime follows the weeks along right here on PBS Fort Wayne. For Fred McKissack and Mike Wolf and Mitch Harper, I'm Bruce Haines. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and we'll see you next week. Good night. The preceding program on PBS Fort Wayne was made possible in part by
The Rogers Company has been conducting business in Northeast Indiana since 1944 as Rogers Markets and now as The Rogers Company with commercial property and real estate development. Pleased to support local not-for-profits and PBS Fort Wayne.